If we ask ourselves who has been the greatest chess player of all time, probably two names come to mind: Magnus Carlsen and Garry Kasparov. If we have to choose which of the two to study in order to improve our own level, personally, I prefer to study Garry Kasparov's games. Why? Because nowadays, with the chess engines, it's very hard to understand the games of these super grandmasters, of the grandmasters from years ago. So today, I'm bringing you a game by Garry Kasparov that is probably one of the best he's ever played in his life. But not because it was spectacular, or because he sacrificed his queen and all that. It's because we can take away some lessons that, as always, will really help us understand chess a little better, and of course, improve when it comes to playing our own games. In this game, he faced one of his toughest rivals, Alexei Shirov, in the year 1994. Shirov went for the well-known Sicilian defense today, and Kasparov chose the open line, as you'll see next. Knight to f3, e6, d4. This is called the open Sicilian line. As always, I'll go through this part a bit faster, because it's theory we've already studied many times. Pawn takes par, knight takes pawn, knight to f6 attacking the e4 square, and knight to c6 defending it. With this opening sequence, and following the move of knight to c6, this Sicilian defense is widely known as the Sicilian Pelican. Not yet, but because of what we're about to see next. Let me explain. What problem do the black pieces have? And what does Kasparov spot very well here? He realizes there's a very weak square, and that square is d6. How can we spot a weak square, Chessteacher? Well, it's that square that can't be defended by pawns. Alright? As you can see, the c-pawn is no longer there, so it will never be able to defend it, and the e-pawn has advanced. So no pawn will be able to move to threaten the d6 square. It's even weaker if there's a pawn behind the square. Alright? We've identified a weak square, so Kasparov doesn't hesitate for a second to bring in the knight and the queen to the d6 point. So he forces the player with the black pieces to play this move here, d6. Is all of this clear? Perfect. All of this is theory, alright? Bishop to f4 is once again threatening the d6 square. And now, of course, we enter the pelican with the move e5. This e5 has to be played no matter what. And why is that? Because the d6 square is being attacked by too many pieces. Therefore, now we've lost a tempo with the bishop, because we're going to have to move it. But our opponent has also lost a tempo, because they first played e6 and then e5. Something they could have done in a single move, they didn't too. Just like we did with the bishop. Alright, so all of this is theory, so I'm not going to go through it too slowly. Instead, we're going to focus on the main idea. A 6 threatens the knight, so there's no choice but knight to a3. And now b5. Obviously, we realize they're threatening b4, which would win one of our two knights, so it's a good idea to move it away. Knight to d5. Pros and cons of the position. Alright, we've reached a point where several moves have been played, and we need to start understanding what's going on. As a big plus, we have this d5 square, which is once again an extremely weak square, and we've managed to place a knight there. Another advantage is this threat we have. Although to be fair, it could be easily neutralized with bishop to e7, which is actually what happened in the game, right? And honestly, nothing really happens as a result. The good thing about the Sicilian for black pieces, and this works against us, is that if we're not able to capitalize on our current space advantage, our dynamic advantage, in the long run, black might end up with a better structure for the endgame, right? This is what makes the Sicilian defense so powerful. How can we continue there? Would it be a good idea to take out one of the bishops with knight takes on e7, winning the bishop pair? Well, this is probably something a lot of you intermediate level players might be thinking, right? We take out a bishop, we take away the bishop pair with our knight. The difference here is that if we captured this bishop, they would recapture with the knight. And now these two knights, together with the pawn, will be putting pressure on the d5 square, and the solution to black's problem, getting rid of their weakness on d5, would become much easier. So after pawn takes, the knight could come over here, and this would be a big help for black's pieces. Therefore, it's clear that we don't want to capture this bishop here just yet. That said, it wouldn't be a bad idea at all to capture this knight with the bishop. We're taking out one of the most important defenders in exchange for the bishop pair. You'll see why this is so important. Bishop takes. Obviously, we don't want to capture this bishop again because our knight is much more important, so we need to think about how to continue. The idea is that there are a lot of possible moves here, okay? We can play, for example, g3 to fianchetto our bishop. That's possible, although I don't really like it much. We could play, for example, bishop e2. Any move, but there's one move that's played a lot here, which is this one, the one Kasparov played, c3, with some very interesting ideas. First, it blocks the semi-open file for the black pieces. It is essential for players to recognize and deeply understand that when we have a strategic semi-open file, the real stars on those files are the rooks, because they truly thrive there and exert significant power across the board. It won't be possible to attack head-on in any way. We're also preventing any kind of advance on b4. We're helping the queen if she wants to come out via b3, and we're also making it easier for the knight to be repositioned through c2. See how versatile this move is? c3, if we start to understand how to really read the position, we'll find moves that hadn't even crossed our minds. Bishop to b7, excuse me. And here, honestly, we would once again have a lot of options, really. We could develop the bishop. Kasparov plays knight to c2, a very good option, so that in the future we can move to e3 while defending the knight on d5, which is an extremely strong knight. And for now, that's what we want to keep, right? That amazing knight. Here, the more experienced players will already understand Shirov's move, but probably those of you who aren't as strong or haven't been playing chess for that long will find this move hard to understand. Shirov's D-cast, where he pulls the knight back and returns it to its original square. Knight to b8. How can that be, Chessteacher? Well, it's actually very good. Here, Shirov is doing two things. He's giving the bishop a free day so it can put pressure on the knight, this really strong knight we have on d5, and he's also giving this knight another route. He wants to come through d, and who knows, maybe to a, b, or... But this knight from here is now transforming. You already know that knights are excellent at maneuvering, and it can go out wherever it feels like. Very good. If you've been paying attention to the latest videos on the channel, you'll have understood the principles of double weakness, and this will start to sound familiar to you. That's why, if we carefully analyze and study, well, not all, but the vast majority of the videos we can, the ones we're uploading, we'll be able to derive a significant number of valuable conclusions. Fixed thanks to our pawn on e4, and thanks to our knight on d5, which is in an advanced position. And we already know that when we have a weakness, we should look for the principle of the second weakness. You'll also understand then the move a4, which we also saw with the black pieces a couple of days ago on the channel. The strategic idea here is that if we capture after a takes b5, this b5 pawn would now be captured. And no matter how much they try to defend it, this pawn will still be a constant target for attack, and therefore also a clear weakness. If we manage to give black two distinct weaknesses, our game will be much easier for us to eventually win. So, logically, what Shirov does is capture the pawn before that weakness is created. You get it, right? Of course, rook takes a4, the pawn is recovered. It's true that this rook isn't very well placed, but you'll soon see the fantastic maneuver it makes. What is it that makes Garry Kasparov logically understand chess like no one else? You're gonna see it because it's gonna fascinate you. Knight to d7, as you know, it can come out via b6 or c5, and from both squares it would attack the rook. So what does Kasparov do? Rook to b4. Normally, a rook is popularly worth 5 points, right? Whereas a bishop or knight is worth 3 points. But what happens then? That a rook is worth 5 points at the end of the game. It's important for you to know this. Because at the beginning of the game, which is worth more? Tell me, is this knight or this rook worth more? Without a doubt, this knight is worth much more than a rook right now. It's worth 4 points, and this rook is worth 1 point because it's not doing anything at all. In other words, the value of the pieces is relative. So pay attention to what Kasparov did. He's threatening the bishop, and Shirov defends it with knight to c5. And without being attacked, he gives up his rook for the bishop. Rook takes on b7. Pay attention, in chess, this is called a quality sacrifice, because we're sacrificing a rook worth 5 points for a bishop worth 3 points. This is a quality sacrifice. But as we were saying, that bishop at the start of the game was worth much more than a rook. We've brought a rook that was just sitting here doing nothing. Sorry, a rook that was here doing nothing, probably worth 1 or 2 points, and we've traded it for a very powerful bishop. So in this position, Kasparov has an extremely strong position, thanks to the dynamism of his pieces. b4, this is a really interesting move that you can always use when you want to block a knight. This is called making an umbrella. Look at all the things we learned from a single game, huh? That's why it's a good idea to watch all the games we upload to the channel, or as many as you can, or whichever ones you feel like, right? So you can learn a ton of patterns. The difference between us and the best players in the world is that they know a lot more patterns, I can assure you. The idea is that this umbrella we're making means the knight can't jump anywhere, and we achieve this whenever we place a pawn 2 squares away from a knight. So we're trying to punish the opponent's pieces that are clearly much worse than ours. Here, even if we're down the exchange, consider this. For those of you who are more advanced, listen. If you have the exchange up, let's suppose we're playing black and we want to trade pieces to reach an endgame where the rooks become powerful and are worth 5 points, and our opponent doesn't have them in this case. But what happens then? Imagine that black manages to trade this bishop for this knight, something that could be completely normal. In fact, in this position, they played bishop to g5. Why? So that if white brings the knight to e3, the bishop can be exchanged for the knight. Imagine they trade this one for that one and that one for this one. At first glance, this might initially seem like a fantastic position for black, right? Well, yes, but we could strategically plant this powerful bishop right on the d5 square, and absolutely no one at all, could ever kick this bishop out of its spot. Primarily because it would be perfectly protected by a solid pawn and sitting firmly on a very advanced post. When there are only rooks left on the board, it becomes completely impossible to remove it from that square. He understands chess like no one else. Instead of knight to e3, knight to a3, so as not to trade that knight for the bishop. The more pieces there are on the board, the better it is for the sides. And now knight to c4. Notice how the knights are starting to position themselves in a super powerful way, while the opponent's rooks still aren't doing anything at all. If we were to capture that pawn with a pawn from a5, that would be very bad, because it would go knight takes, probably knight takes, and then queen takes, for example. This pawn would still be extremely weak, we wouldn't be castled, and we'd still have to develop the bishop and castle. It wouldn't be a good idea to capture this pawn. We'd rather optimize development and castle. It's crucial to recognize, even though Kasparov has made a significant number of complex maneuvers here and still hasn't castled, he's had more important things to do, and for now, since the king can't be easily attacked, he's decided to postpone that move for a little while longer. Pawn takes pawn. Which do we capture with? With the pawn or with the knight? Well, obviously we should capture with the pawn, because if we capture with the knight, we're freeing up our opponent's knight on b7. If we capture with the pawn, we create the umbrella again, and this knight is once again stuck because it can't get out of here. See? If you know the umbrella pattern, how well? Will this pattern work for you in your games? The truth is, yes. Here, Shirov makes an inaccuracy. Let me explain. What is the correct plan here for the black pianist? It's very easy to say now that we've studied the game, of course, obviously. Logically, I have extensively used engines to really understand the plan. It certainly doesn't mean I'm a better player than Shirov. I think that is more than clear, right? On the seventh file, and when the white king castled, the queen would go through c8, then come to e6, and then probably move to h6, thus directly attacking the opponent's king. Obviously, this plan is not easy to find at all. And Shirov plays a pretty human move as well, which is queen to b8. Even though it might initially seem like this queen isn't doing anything important, Queen to b4 actually comes into play when this knight moves, and it also allows this other knight to move freely, because otherwise, in many different cases, this very weak spot that the black pieces have on d6 could be lost quite easily. Remember, it's one of the weaknesses, maybe the only one right now, that we have to take advantage of. In any case, remember that we're down the exchange, so we have to be super active with our pieces. And Kasparov understands this perfectly, because this game is amazing to study. At this point, as you can see, since we're down the exchange, we logically have to be extremely active, or else we'll end up with a lost endgame. H4 threatens the bishop, and when it moves, he doesn't waste time castling, but instead keeps improving his pieces and plays knight from c to b6, attacking the rook. Now, almost by force, Shirov places his rook on the 7th rank at a2. You already know that putting a rook on the 7th rank is usually extremely lethal. In the future, for example, you could open up with f5 and connect both rooks on this point. The queen could come over, right? And this could be extremely dangerous for white. Castling. The plan of, for example, queen to e8, queen to e6, and then bringing her over, say, to g6 is still good. However, logically, that would be admitting the mistake. And for us chess players, it's a bit hard to admit we've made a mistake. Rook to d6, defended by the bishop and attacking our queen, seems much more human. Queen f3, queen a7. For now, they're not really doing anything to us, so we can keep going with our plans. And here, even though it's not the best move, maybe the best move would be bishop to b5, activating all our pieces even more. However, Kasparov plays a move that seems really, really, really good, and that move is knight to d7. Obviously, at this point, some very, very strong threats are starting to appear. For example, let's suppose that here. Black, Shirov, ignores everything and plays, say, queen to a2 and goes on the attack. The idea is that this game would already be completely won for the white pieces. Besides the simple fact that the rook on that square is currently being captured, which isn't even the most important thing here, they could also maneuver their powerful knights into the attack, moving the knight specifically to the e7 square, check, and then king to h8 is the only forced move available. And they probably deliver mate on 8. Therefore, this would be a completely lost position for black. So you can't just ignore the threat. What would be the best move for black here? So you might be wondering, probably the best move is, sorry, this queen is in exile. The best move would be rook to a8, keeping up the pressure, but this still looks pretty delicate, because it looks like you're pulling all your pieces away from defending your king, and the knights could come in with a lot of force. So, with what seems like a very logical approach, Shiro went knight to d8, giving up the rook, yes, but bringing a knight into the defense. Careful, he's giving up the rook, but he already has an extra rook, so he's just giving back the material he was up. Therefore, here, Kasparov decides to capture the rook. King takes f8. And even though now we are completely equal in terms of material, well, not just equal, we have the same material, but we have a passed pawn. So we are actually in a much more favorable position. We are going to try to win this game, and Kasparov does not let these kinds of games slip through his fingers. Probably many of you here are thinking, well, I see an extremely equal position here where I wouldn't really know how to win either. So let's see how Kasparov does it, because that way we can pick up some ideas to use ourselves later on in our own games. b5, which is his most beautiful move, right? Once again, he traps this knight, which can't get out in any way. We don't want them to play knight to c6, because then knight to d4 would come, and they'd be doing the same as us, placing a very strong knight. The game continues with queen to a3. Shirov improves his queen and attacks this bishop with 2 pieces. What would you play here with white? Because it seems like we should move the bishop away immediately, but if we do, they trade queens. What should we do? So pay attention, because Kasparov told Shirov, go ahead and take my bishop if you want. I'm going to play queen to f5. Obviously, this bishop can't be captured. No matter if they take with the queen or the rook, we could continue, for example, with queen to d7, threatening a knight that basically can't move. And if it does, then queen to e7 and queen to e8 would be checkmate. Therefore, this bishop can't be taken. So what does Shirov do then? He brings his king over to e8, which is a good move. However, now that he hasn't taken the bishop, I can move it away. This monstrous bishop, look where it's aiming, right at the f7 square. Now, there are a lot of discovered attacks, like knight to c7 check, and then we can come in here once we get rid of this knight, right? Obviously, we haven't lost a bishop anymore. If our attack was strong even when we were giving away the bishop, just imagine how strong it is if it's the same attack and we still keep the bishop, right? So this already looks almost like a walk in the park for Kasparov. Not for us, though. What does Kasparov do? Why, he says, go ahead and take it if you want. I'll just promote to a queen on the 7. Let's see what happens if he takes the different. It's very simple. If rook takes bishop, we would simply win the game as follows. Queen to g8 check, king to d7 is forced, and then we could continue with knight to b6 check and win back the rook. Honestly, there's nothing better for the black pieces than to play all these moves. So here, what did they do? They captured the bishop, the queen came in with check on g8, king to d7, and now knight to b6, and we win back the rook. In this case, now we end up with an extra exchange. Now, what do black do? Well, they have to get out of check. We take the rook, attack the queen, which moves to c5, and we have to keep playing to win the game. Careful, it looks like a walk in the park, but it doesn't. They're attacking our knight, and once again, Kasparov sacrifices it again. Don't tell me Kasparov's reading of the position isn't impressive. It's true that the queen is covering the a7 square, but if they decide to capture this knight, the game would quickly end with rook to a7. We'd capture this knight with check, and this would be completely lost. That's why Shirov tries to hold on with the move queen to d4, attacking this point, attacking the knight, and still mainly defending against the rook entering on a7. Change of route, rook to a3. Now the rook can swing over via the third rank. The bishop comes to attack the rook on c1, and this next move is truly impressive. Pay attention, because you're going to be amazed. Knight to e3, sacrificing the rook, and now giving up the pawn here. Well, not really giving up the pawn, but you could trade this bishop for the knight. Let's be precise. No pawn is actually being given away. But think about this. If you take the rook, knight to f5 wins the queen. Check, and I take the clue. And if you capture my knight, then simply I would play rook takes e3, and I'd be left with an endgame with an extra pawn, the b5 pawn. And on top of that, it would be a passed pawn. And of course, I could even capture this g7 pawn in most cases, and then I'd have another passed pawn on the h-file. Therefore, here the best move for black, logically, would be to capture this knight. Of course, Shirov resigned here after rook takes e, and as you can see, it's impossible to stop. All these threats from the white pieces, especially because the extra pawn is a passed pawn, and it would be impossible to stop it. For example, many of you might think, I'll come over here to stop it with the queen, but I simply take this pawn here, like I was saying, and no matter if you take this one, I'm going to end up queening this h-pawn, which has no opposition. So that's what Kasparov did to end up winning this game. What'd you think? An amazing game, right? Do you like it when I explain things to you? With this kind of game, we can draw a lot of conclusions. I love it. So if you enjoyed it, leave a big like. I'll leave both my book and a link to subscribe to the free newsletter down below in the description, as well as access to Winning Models training with a Grandmaster if you're interested. I'll leave everything down below in the description, everything that's currently available. Obviously, the 30-day pack that you all sold out, I can't include it because you snapped it up right away. Alright? All these things. For those of you who weren't quick enough, I'm really sorry, but you can't access it anymore. Okay? I hope you love this video, and as always, I'll see you tomorrow in the next one. Friends, goodbye.